Okay, so 2 weeks ago, because it was, I think was it right after the presidential election? We talked for a good long time to explain and discuss the Electoral College. So we got that out of the way. Took up more time than it normally would, but that's fine. So now let's jump into U.S. history. So we have a timeline. I always think timelines are good, so you can kind of visualize things. And what's what's most important to understand is how long that period was that we talked about of the colonial period. America was British. The area of America was British colonies for a super long time. And then you have the different wars, the American Revolution, the Civil War, followed by the Reconstruction. And we're going to talk about these things: World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the Cold War. We're definitely going to talk about. Okay. So let's jump into some things. So we've talked about 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Declaration of Independence. We talked about the colonial period and how, tensions rose over time and how they wanted to declare independence from Britain. And so they did. Declaration of Independence was written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, and says that the British are not fair in their rule over the American colonies. It declares the 13 colonies to be an independent nation, the United States of America. Okay, so we talked about that. A couple of people you definitely want to know. You may see their picture or you may see their name on the GED test, the high set test, but certainly these are good people to know. I'd say George Washington, the most common person, most common name you're going to hear. Thomas Jefferson is important, and James Madison's important too. Not as in our face as George Washington can be, but also important. Okay, so it says George Washington, he was very popular. Before he was our first president, he was a general in the colonial army fighting in the American Revolution. And because he was the first president, he set a lot of traditions and habits that we associate with the president today. Brittany, thank you for logging in. Thanks. Brittany, we were talking, and we just started a minute or two ago, so you didn't miss much here. So no big deal. Okay, so George Washington, super popular, super well known, first president, and really did a good job. Was a really good president. Did not have many enemies. Now, some people disagreed with how he did this or that, but really didn't have that many enemies at the time or since then. Thomas Jefferson was America's third president. He was president, and he's on is he on the $5 bill, $20 bill? I think, is Lincoln on the $5 bill and Jefferson's at 20, I think. And Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Okay, James Madison, I don't think he's on any money, but he was pretty important. He was America's fourth president. He was, one of these guys we call the founding fathers. And he didn't come up with all the ideas, but was the person who wrote the Constitution. So we often call him the father of the Constitution. A lot of social studies teachers, historians call James Madison the father of the Constitution. Okay, so there's three important people for you to know. Okay, so George Washington is president after the Constitution is passed. Okay, so he's 1789 to 1797. Then we have John Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. So James Madison, his presidency takes us 1809 to 1817. So now we're into the 1800s. Okay. 1803, which is actually during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. 1803, America makes the Louisiana Purchase, or the purchase, the buying of land. Some people say it's the Louisiana Territory. So Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana Territory, same thing. And in this map on the left-hand side, the orange is the states at that time, the United States of America. The light blue is territory. So we have Michigan territory, Indiana territory, Illinois territory, Mississippi territory. Land becomes a territory before it becomes a state of the United States. And of course, we see the map expanding. It goes westward, and in a flash, Thomas Jefferson agreed to buy, I forget how many millions of acres, 3 million, I don't even know, 3 million acres or something, millions of acres from the French. Okay, the French had colonies over here. The Spanish had colonies. We, of course, are from the British colonies that turned into America. But the Spanish and French had colonies as well. And so Thomas Jefferson, as president, negotiates and buys all of France's land. They needed money, so they got rid of it. And the Louisiana Territory, the most important thing is it goes down into New Orleans and gives you control of both, at the time, very important, both sides of the very important Mississippi River. Okay, so that's a big deal. So then we have the map starting to expand into the United States that we recognize today. Now, it took over most of the 1800s before we got there, but it's an idea called manifest destiny. Okay, destiny, like it's America's destiny to expand across the continent. Jennifer, thanks for logging in.
Hello.
So you see, you know, the USA that we recognize starts to take shape, and you know, land that doesn't belong to America goes from not belonging to America to territory status, and then it becomes a state. And so the states start to form. You can see all their outlines there, but that's, you know, they don't really know that at the time. And so this famous painting is the idea of manifest destiny, okay? That it is America's destiny to take that shape, to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And so you see in this famous painting, they're expanding westward. They're going from the cities, you see big bridges, sailing ships. And so what are some other things that show the expansion in this famous painting? What are some things that show America expanding? What do you see? Pretty much everything in here has some meaning, right? So what do we see in this painting? Anybody? Anybody, name one thing we see. Jennifer, can you see the screen? Can you see that painting?
Yeah, what the things the lady handle? Is the Constitution or something?
What is it? It says something on there. It says something book. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's could, well, it's actually, let me look.
Is a Constitution?
No, I don't think it could. That would make sense. That would make a lot of sense. It says something book. I can't quite make it out.
Yeah.
I don't know what. It doesn't appear to be the Constitution, although that would make sense if it did. So she has a book. We don't know what that is, so you know we can't really say that. But what is she? What's in her hand? What else is in her hand? She's putting down.
Is a string?
It looks like it wouldn't be telephone, right? They didn't have telephones back then, but telegraph wire. So,
Oh, yeah.
you know, that's kind of what and this is all symbolism. It's symbolic, right? There's not some giant lady in a white gown putting down telegraph wires, but it's showing the expansion. Okay. We also see the railroad behind her expanding. We see covered wagons, people expanding across the frontier, exploring. We see farmers exploring. We see buffaloes and Native Americans being pushed away across the continent, which today we can look back and say, oh, well, that's not really fair that they drove away the buffalo and drove away the Native Americans. But back then, that was part of, expanding across the continent. There were Native Americans that lived everywhere. And so if you are the white Americans, if it's not good, but the part of expanding across the continent was pushing away and getting rid of the Native Americans so you could take their place. So it's not good, but that's part of, it made it into this painting because it was part of that process. And nature, we see a bear down in the corner. We see the bison being pushed across.
Is this water is Mississippi River?
It
Or
could
what?
be on the right-hand side or down below.
This water, yeah.
Yeah, it could be the Mississippi River. We see maybe the Rocky Mountains in the background. So this is, and it actually in the upper left, we see perhaps that's an ocean that maybe that's the Pacific Ocean. So this is symbolic, okay? And this was a famous painting. You see it in history books all the time. This is embraces and embodies the push across the continent, okay? That is an important, that westward expansion. America was expanding westward. That's a very important idea in the 1800s in the United States. Okay. So that leads us to the middle of the century, the Civil War. Okay. As the nation expanded westward and every state, territory becomes a state, Oklahoma becomes a state, Mississippi becomes a state. That whole Louisiana territory, all that land is divided up and they cut it up and they turn it into states. As every state becomes a state, there's one big decision that they need to make. Every state needs to make this decision. What is that big decision that they need to make? Back then, early 1800s, what's the one big question that maybe everybody has as they're making a new state? Well, we're looking at the Civil War here on our screen. So what do you think they're fighting about? What do you think I'm thinking about those states?
I don't know. In my mind, civic war is fighting about the free slavery, right?
Right. Now there's a lot of reasons for the Civil War, but the main focus is it was the states that have slavery versus the states that don't have slavery. So as in that westward expansion, the decades, the 1830s, the 1840s, 1850s, that lead up to that period before the Civil War, as every state becomes a state, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, North Dakota, as every state becomes a state, they have to decide, the people of that state have to decide, are we going to have slavery in Oklahoma, in Kansas? And so that, the people in the South, in the American South that have slavery, were very afraid that slavery would end. And of course, people did want slavery to end in the North and the South. But the people in the South were very afraid that they were going to end slavery. And so what happens is there's an election, 1860, and Abraham Lincoln wins the election of 1860 and becomes president, as always happens, in the next spring and in the winter, January. I don't know if it was January. They used to have it in March, but he's inaugurated in early 1861. Abraham Lincoln, the South then secedes from the country. They try to form their own country. Those southern states don't want to be part of America anymore because they felt that now that Abraham Lincoln is president in 1861, he's going to end slavery, and we don't want that in the South. We don't want the end to slavery. So they seceded. They broke away, just like America broke away from the British colonies. Okay, the southern states, 7 and then 11 total southern states, broke away, formed their own country called the Confederacy. So that's what we have on the right-hand side. The South was, they considered themselves their own country, the Confederate States of America, the CSA instead of USA. Okay, and that's of course a Confederate flag on the bottom right. The North, the rest of America, didn't want the South to secede, didn't want the South to break away. So they fought a war. A war broke out, and it lasted from 1861 to 1865. The North we call the Union. It was the original United States of America. Now, slavery was legal in some northern states, but it was not as important as it was in the South. In the South, they relied heavily on the slavery of African Americans. Now, once war breaks out, the North has all the advantages, most of the advantages. There's more people, they have a larger population. There's more railroad tracks, so you can travel and get supplies around more easily when you're fighting a war. They have more factories, more manufacturing. They have more soldiers. And of course, they have an advantage of being a country. They have a military. They are ready. They are already a country. The South, I put the major disadvantages. They are a new and unorganized nation. They don't have a government. They need to make one. They don't have an army. They need to make one. Right? So they're just, as a war is being fought, they're turning into a country, which is a pretty big disadvantage. That's going to slow you down. Okay. To the North and the South. That's what the Civil War was fought over. Now, in this map, the yellow are the Confederate states that broke away, that seceded. The blue are the Union states. The orange is the territories that are not yet turned into states. Now, the green on this map is part of the Union, okay, but we call them border states. Now, everybody thinks that, oh, the North doesn't have slavery, the South has slavery, right? Everybody thinks that, and that's okay. But it's not actually entirely true. Some states in the North had slavery. It's these green border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. Those are the border states. They are states that had slavery, but did not secede, did not break away from the country. Okay, so we consider them part of the North. They are the Union. They're fighting the South, although they do have slavery. Okay, so generally speaking, the South has slavery, the North doesn't have slavery, although specifically these border states do have slavery. They just did not choose to break away from the country like these yellow southern states did. Okay, all right, so during the Civil War, Lincoln makes his Emancipation Proclamation. It takes effect on January 1st, 1863, and emancipation means to set free. If you emancipate somebody, it means to set them free. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation, he's proclaiming the freedom of slaves. But this is during the Civil War. Okay, so he says that it says on our screen, Lincoln declares that slaves in areas of rebellion are free. Okay, so the southern states that are rebelling against the United States, their slaves are free. Well, I mean, those people don't care. The slave owners in the South don't care what Lincoln says because they don't view Lincoln as their president. So it doesn't matter if he says that their slaves are free. They're not going to listen, right? They view themselves as a different and new country. And Abraham Lincoln is not their president. They elected another president. They have their own president. So they don't care what Lincoln says. So the people talk about the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves. It really did not. Lincoln will free the slaves later, and we'll talk about that, but not through the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, it happens later. Actually, we did talk about it. The 13th Amendment, a constitutional amendment, makes it official, frees the slaves, and that's 1865, just before the end of the Civil War. Lincoln does free the slaves, but it's not with the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. Then he gives the Gettysburg Address, and this isn't very important to history. It didn't change history, but it actually it's a very famous speech, and so it's good to be aware of. The Gettysburg Address is the one that starts 7 years ago. It's that speech. And actually, I looked in the newspaper today. I think it was either today or yesterday, but I think I saw it today. Today in 1863 is the date of the Gettysburg Address. So what is it? November 19th. He made the Gettysburg Address. Now, what it was the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the 3-day, very bloody, tremendously important Battle of Gettysburg happens in July of 1863. Okay, the Union won. They pushed back the Confederate forces. They won. It was the most northern that the Southern Army had ever gotten in the war, and so it was a big deal. The North wins. The Union wins the Battle of Gettysburg, but like 60,000, I forget how many thousand people, 60,000 people, so like tons of thousands and thousands of men died in the Battle of Gettysburg. To commemorate, to dedicate a to dedicate a cemetery at the battlefield, they invite the president. So in November, after the battle in July, in November, they are dedicating a cemetery at Gettysburg. And so they invite the president of the United States, and he decides to go, and he makes a speech. It's a very short speech. I think it took him 2 minutes. It's not long, but it's everything Lincoln writes is very nice. And so it was a very good speech. Okay. Gettysburg Address is a famous speech. You may be asked to look at it someday. And if you do, it's good to know exactly what it was. It was dedicating a cemetery. It wasn't a big speech about what they're going to do in the war, this battle or that battle. It was a very general speech saying what they're fighting for and how hard everyone was fighting at the time. Okay, so that's the Civil War. The Reconstruction era is the era after the Civil War. Okay, the North wins. The Southern states are brought back into the country, but of course they were just fighting a war. So there's a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of anger, a lot of hostility, even after the Civil War ends. The South surrenders, and Lincoln wants to bring them back into the country. And he says, we're not going to punish them, the states or the individuals who fought in the Confederate Army. We're not going to punish them, even though they just fought a war against us. We're going to welcome them in, and we're going to heal the country, and we're going to move forward. This period is called the Reconstruction period. Okay, so let me read this paragraph. It says, the Reconstruction era was the period in American history that lasted from 1863 to 1877, following the American Civil War, and is a significant chapter in the history of American civil rights. Reconstruction ended the remnants of Confederate secession, the breaking away, and abolished slavery, making the newly freed slaves citizens with civil rights guaranteed by 3 new constitutional amendments. Reconstruction also refers to the attempt to transform the 11 southern former Confederate states, as directed by Congress, and the role of the Union states in that transformation. So as a reconstruction of the country, right? We're piecing the country back together after it was ripped apart by a civil war, and also literally reconstructing the southern states. That most of the fighting happened in the South for a 4-year war. Most of the fighting happened in the South. So cities were burned, people's homes were wrecked, like people didn't have their jobs. Okay, 620,000 men lost their lives in the Civil War. So these were reconstructing the country, but also literally rebuilding things in the South, rebuilding cities, rebuilding railroads. Okay. During the Reconstruction period, you have not Native Americans, African Americans. Slavery ends, so they become free. Then the African American men, not women, but men, become citizens. And then those African American citizens of any race, can vote. Okay, so like we talked about in last week, you go from being a slave to a voting citizen, if you're a man, not a woman, you go from a slave to a voting citizen in 5 years. That's a very big deal, a very fast change. So America was very excited about this change during the Reconstruction period, 1863. African Americans are elected to Congress, serving in the United States Senate for the first time ever. Okay. Former slaves are now senators in Washington, D.C. Big deal. It's a very big deal. But in the 1870s, 1877, things started to fall apart. The racism comes back in America, and a lot of that progress starts to slide backwards. Okay, so kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as you get sometimes in American history. Okay, so the Civil War followed by the Reconstruction period the Reconstruction period is a way they are bringing the South, both the white slaveholders that fought against the Union in the war, but also the black slaves, bringing them into society, making reconstructing society to make things work. Okay, 1860s, 1870s. Now we're going to jump to World War One. Okay, and I say the most important thing about World War One is what happened when it was over. It wasn't it was a big deal. Lots of people died. America got into World War One near the very end. It was almost a 4-year war, and America was only in it for about the last 1 year. America did not play a big role in World War One. Okay, it's part of our history, but not as big a deal as it is, say, in Britain or France. We were only fighting in World War One for about 1 year, less than 1 year, really. But what's important is the way it ended. If you think of it as good guys and bad guys, we were the good guys. We were with Britain and France. We were allied. America was allied with Britain and France, fighting against the Germans. Now, this isn't World War II. This is not Nazi Germany. We'll get to that. But this is World War I. But we were fighting the Germans. Okay, the British and French won, and we won World War I. And at the end of the war, they signed the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, Versailles is a city in France. You name the treaty after the city that you sign it in, so it's the Treaty of Versailles. Ends World War I. What happened was they decided to punish the Germans. They said, well, they just put us through a terrible war for 4 years. We're going to punish them. And so Britain and France took control of the German colonies, and they punished Germany economically. Okay, they made them pay money. Germany had to pay money to Britain and France because they fought the war. Okay, so Germany is very, very hurt by by how the war ends. Not only did they just lose a war, but now that Britain and France are really punishing them for fighting the war. Okay, which they can do. I suppose it's your right when you win a war to do that. But what happens was, what was going to happen is going to directly lead to World War II. Okay, World War I, not that important. It's, as I say here, it's mostly viewed now as pointless. It didn't change much. But what happened was the way that it ended leads to World War II. So let's look at that. Okay, World War I ends in 1918. What happens in 1929 and then through the 1930s? Okay, I don't have it here, but what happens in 1929 and through the 1930s? Anybody know? In, I think, October 1929, the United States stock market crashed. 1929. What does that lead to? The big giant stock market crash leads to what in the 1930s? A long period of economic hardship. What do we call that period in the 1930s? Anybody know? Maybe our grandparents may have lived through it. Any ideas? The stock market crashes 1829 or 1929, leads to the Great Depression. Okay, have you heard of the Great Depression? Through the 1930s, Great Depression, millions of people lost their jobs. Very big deal. Through the 1930s, America economically was very weak. Okay, much of the world was very weak. So now let's look at the outcome that happens after World War One. Okay, 1933, the Germans are still angry, still hurt by the way they were treated after World War One. Okay, they're weak, they're embarrassed, they're being punished. Okay, their colonies have been taken over by Britain and France. And so 1933, Adolf Hitler comes to power in Germany, and he says he's going to return Germany to its former glory. Okay, now Adolf Hitler is the guy holding his hat in this picture. Okay, little mustache, swoop of hair. Now, this is not 1933. But Adolf Hitler starts at the bottom of German politics and slowly, works the system and climbs up to become the top, the chancellor of Germany. He has a political party called the Nazi Party. And as Adolf Hitler is climbing up through power through German politics and the government, the world is looking, and now he gives these crazy speeches and he talks about things, but the world basically says, well, you know what, we're not going to mess with this guy over there in Germany. We don't like it, we don't like what he says, but we're going to let him do whatever he wants to do. So in 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. Okay, they invade their neighbor country with soldiers and take over part of Poland. Well, the world still says, well, okay, we don't like that, but we're going to let that happen because, what are you going to do? We don't want to fight a war over it. And so they ignore Germany. Well, then Germany not only invaded Poland, but starts to invade more countries in Central Europe. And so a world war breaks out. The world, Britain and France, start to push against and fight the Nazi Germans. Okay, 1941, the Nazis invade Russia. Russia is a very big country. The Nazis invade Russia, who they were allied with. They were friends, Germany and Russia. They were on the same side. But when the Nazis invade Russia, now they're not friends, now they're enemies. And so Russia joins and becomes an ally with Britain. Okay, so that's an important turning point. The Nazis invade Russia in 1941. You have, during this whole time period, the first half of World War I, 1939 into 1941, America is saying, you know what, that's not our war. That's over there in Britain. We're not involved. That's not our problem. We were isolationists. We wanted to be isolated. We didn't want to take part in somebody else's war. But then December 7th, 1941, the Japanese, who were on the side of Nazi Germany, fly a ton of planes across the Pacific Ocean to Hawaii and bomb the Pearl Harbor military base in Hawaii. Okay, Hawaii's right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese fly across the Pacific Ocean and bomb America's military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They thought it was a surprise attack. They thought that they would scare the United States into staying out of the war. America was not in the war. America was not fighting in World War II. The Japanese attack and blow up our military base in Pearl Harbor with the intention of scaring America into not, definitely, that's too scary. We're not going to get in the war now. what happened was it didn't work because America the next day declared war. Now, the Constitution gives the power to declare war to Congress. And so President Roosevelt went to Congress the next day and asked them to declare war, and they did. They voted. And the next day, December 8th, 1941, America enters Pearl Harbor, or America enters World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Okay, that's a big deal. Now, there's a ton of information. You could study World War II, for the rest of your life. But basically, the Nazis failed in their invasion of Russia because Russia is a very big country and it's very difficult to invade a very big country. By the end of 1944, the Nazis were trapped on both sides by the Allies, the British and the United States, coming in from the west, and the Russians, who now hated them, coming in from the east. They were getting sandwiched between these two groups. So the Germans are back in Germany, in the capital of Berlin. Adolf Hitler is in Berlin. He has a secret bunker, and he's hiding in his secret bunker in Berlin. He marries his girlfriend one night, Eva Braun. I don't know why I remember his girlfriend's name, but he marries his girlfriend, and then the next day they kill themselves in his bunker. So Adolf Hitler was never captured. He never died in battle. He killed himself hiding in his bunker because he knew that the war was coming to an end. He knew he was going to lose. And so he killed himself. Germany surrenders unconditionally on May 8th, 1945. And we have this famous picture from a New York parade, and then this famous newspaper that says it's VE Day. VE is Victory in Europe. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Okay, and so that seems like the end of the war. But as I say here, it's not over because there's really two halves to World War II. There's the fighting in Europe and there's the fighting in the Pacific with the Japanese. That goes on. Okay, VE Day is May 8th, 1945. It's into August, so June, July, August. So 3 months later, the Japanese are still fighting. And it becomes apparent that they're not going to give up fighting. And so Roosevelt, remember last week we talked about Roosevelt. He was elected 4 times. He dies in office. He dies during World War II. His vice president, Eisenhower, becomes president. Eisenhower makes the decision very quickly in his presidency that this new technology, this new weapon they have, might be useful to end the war. So they drop the world's first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. And so the world sees its first mushroom cloud, its first atomic bomb explosion. Now, no other country had this technology. It was a surprise, bigger than a surprise. It was a shock. Okay, they dropped it on a city, Hiroshima, Japan, kills 100,000 people instantly, and other people got sick and died. And of course, there was fires and injuries. Okay, but the Japanese don't surrender. So 3 days later, Eisenhower says, you know what, we got to do it again. So they drop a second atomic bomb now on Nagasaki, Japan, kills another 100,000 people instantly. And it sent a message. And so by a week later, August 15th, the Japanese surrender. And so they call it VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. So by August 15th, 1945, World War II is over. The Nazi Germany has surrendered. The Japanese now surrender. And so you have the end of World War II. Okay, 1945. The other thing that goes along with World War II is the Holocaust, unfortunately, is the Holocaust. Now, my definition of the Holocaust, and you've probably seen these pictures before, and you might be aware of these concentration camps. They're called concentration camps. But the Holocaust, the definition is the systematic, state-sponsored persecution, and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. So the Nazis, when Adolf Hitler was coming to power, remember after World War I, he was telling the German people, hey, we've been beat up, we lost World War I, we've been punished, this is unfair, we are a great people, and this is not fair. And he said, do you know who's to blame for all this? It's the Jewish people, it's the Jews. So like any crazy leader in history, everybody's always got to have an enemy. And if you can focus the people's anger on one enemy, you can get everybody all excited and angry. And the enemy that Adolf Hitler chose and the Nazis used was the Jews. Okay, so he identified Jewish people as his enemy. And so it's the systematic, there was a system, it's state sponsored, it's the government doing this. This isn't just angry people in your neighborhood acting out. This is the government doing this. Gather up, they'd persecute, they would murder. They'd put in some concentration camps were labor camps. You would work making things. And some were extermination camps. You would go there and you would be killed. And so it's this systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews. But it was also, as my second bullet point here says, it wasn't just Jewish people, it was gypsies. Now, gypsies are a cultural a group in Europe. The physically or mentally handicapped. If you had any physical handicap, a mental handicap, okay, you would be killed. Homosexuals were killed as part of the Holocaust. Political prisoners, anybody who was different, anybody who was not what the Nazis viewed as the perfect person. They said, we're going to exterminate those people. We're going to get rid of anybody who's not perfect. The Nazis' goal was to take over the world and to exterminate anybody who was not a perfect German person. Okay, scary idea, but that was their goal. Adolf Hitler thought that he was going to start a government that would last 1,000 years. Okay, so that was that. So to do that, he needed to exterminate anybody he felt and the Nazis felt were not the perfect type of person. And they had a very particular type of person they thought, Germans. And so anybody who wasn't that, who was Jewish or physically or mentally handicapped, political prisoners who spoke against the Nazis, wrote a book against the Nazis, anybody like that needed to be killed. Okay. So the Holocaust is happening during World War II. American soldiers, the world didn't really know what was happening with the Holocaust. We knew that Adolf Hitler was gathering up Jews and putting them in work camps. Okay, maybe, but the American soldiers came in after they beat, after the end of the war. They entered Germany and they found these work camps, and they found just piles of dead bodies. They found mass graves. They found the gas chambers where people were killed with poisonous gas. And it was a big shock. They did not know this was happening during the war. So the Holocaust was a big shock to the rest of the world, that was possible, that anybody would do that. Okay. So when you talk about World War II, you got to talk about the Holocaust. Okay, let's stop there. Next week, we'll jump in with the Cold War. Actually, here's what we'll do.
We'll jump in the Cold War again.
Well, yeah, because I mean, this is a 4-week class, so 4 weeks is, week 4 is the Cold War, and then on to up to today. But here's what we need.
I know. I just want to say something before we go. There's something I want to say. I know that economics are in the HiSit and GED tests. I know that civics and governments are history, American history, American history and world history. And I know that geography is too. And I'm going to try to do well on that. I want to.
Yeah, well, that's part of next week's class. But here's the thing. as I said earlier, so next we do this class on Thursday. Next Thursday is Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Lisa already sent out the schedule. I didn't, and I thought of this after I'd said this to you. I didn't schedule another class for next week. I didn't schedule
Okay.
a replacement class on like Monday or Tuesday or something. So here's what we're going to do. I will send out today. I will send out the recording for this that we're talking right now. I'll send out the PowerPoint that I'm looking at, and I will send for you to watch on your own next week, everybody, the part 4 class, the week 4 class that covers the Cold War and finishes our discussion of US history, but then also does talk about economics and geography. So we'll cover those topics, but we're not going to cover them live. I'm going to send you a recording of a class I did. I'll send it the class from last month. So you can do that on your own. You can watch, you don't have to watch it next Thursday. You can watch it anytime, but I'll include a video of the part 4 class for you to watch because we won't do that. Then 2 weeks from now, when we come back the week after Thanksgiving,
Mhm.
again, this is a 4-week class. I'll be starting back over on week 1. If you guys want to come, you're welcome to. But I think it might be new students, and we'll start back at week 1 talking about the civics and government again. So that's kind of how this class is meant to be. It's not something you can continue to come every week after week, month after month. But I really am intending this to be a 4-week class for new people coming in. You get everything you need in 4 weeks, and then you go take the test and you move on, and that's okay. So it's up to you guys if you want to come. So next week we won't have class because it's Thanksgiving on Thursday.
Yeah.
I'll include a video of the part 4 class that you can watch on your own. And then 2 weeks from now, I'll restart the cycle with week 1. Okay.
Oh, that
So,
sounds good.
yeah. So any questions on what we talked about today? Yeah,
I just want to say I just like the class. I just do.
yeah, good. No, I like having you guys. It's always good. We have good discussions, and I enjoy sharing this stuff. But it is the same thing month after month because I don't know if other teachers are doing this. I'm kind of the guinea pig to see what happens here. But this is kind of a new idea to do 4-week class and then repeat. Okay. So thanks for logging in. Any other
Well,
questions?
I just want to say that another thing about these colleges, I really want you to know that I like music. I like play music. I like contemporary gospel music. I want to be a